The summer heat wrapped around Maple Street like a warm blanket, the kind that feels just right against your skin. Kids played kickball in the street, sprinklers created rainbows on freshly cut lawns, and ice cream trucks announced their arrival with cheerful jingles that pulled children from their homes with eager smiles. 15-year-old Mateo Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead as he shot another basket in his driveway, the ball making that perfect swishing sound through the net. "Dinner in 30 minutes, Diana called from the front door, her smile visible even from across the yard. "Got it, Mom," Mateo replied, taking one more shot before heading inside. The Rodriguez house wasn't the biggest on Maple Street, but it felt like the warmest. Pictures of family camping trips and Mateo's basketball tournaments lined the hallway. The smell of cumin and cilantro filled the kitchen as Diana prepared her famous chile rellenos, Mateo's favorite dinner. Carlos, Mateo's father, sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, his construction boots kicked off by the door. "How's the jump shot coming along?" Carlos asked without looking up. "Getting better. Coach says if I keep practicing, I might start next season." Diana smiled as she stirred the sauce. She loved these ordinary moments, the simple back and forth between father and son. Mateo grabbed a glass of water and headed to his room to clean up before dinner. Passing the shelf where his Nintendo 64 sat next to a small collection of games. Daniel was supposed to call about that new fighting game they'd been saving up for. Mateo's room was a teenager's typical space. Posters of basketball players on the walls, a desk covered with half-finished gadgets he'd been taking apart and rebuilding, and engineering magazines stacked beside his bed. He wasn't like the other kids on his street. While they were content playing video games, Mateo wanted to understand how they worked. His teachers called him observant. His mother called him an old soul. The phone rang downstairs. "Mateo, it's Daniel," Diana called up. Rushing down, Mateo grabbed the cordless phone. "Hey, did they get it in?" "Yeah, finally. Want to go tomorrow? They only have 3 copies." "Definitely. After I help my dad with the car. Meet you there at noon?" They made plans as Diana set the table, the ordinary conversation of 2 teenage boys excited about a video game. Neither could have known how significant this mundane exchange would become, how it would be remembered and recounted in police reports and newspaper articles. 3 houses down, Gregory Pfizer watched through his living room window as kids played in the street. Most neighbors barely noticed the quiet appliance repairman who had moved in 6 months ago. He kept his yard tidy, waved politely when passed on the street, and never caused trouble. If they had looked closer, they might have noticed how his eyes followed certain children, how he seemed to time his yard work to coincide with after-school hours, how the basement lights sometimes stayed on all night. But nobody looked closer. On Maple Street, people felt safe. They left doors unlocked, and kids played outside until streetlights came on. Why wouldn't they? Nothing bad ever happened here. That evening, the Rodriguez family ate dinner together, discussing Carlos's latest construction project, Diana's book club, and Mateo's upcoming math test. Normal topics, normal voices, the clink of forks against plates punctuating their conversation. After helping with dishes, Mateo worked on homework before playing his Nintendo for an hour. When his mother reminded him about bedtime, he groaned, but didn't argue too much. Tomorrow would be exciting. A new game, time with his best friend, another perfect summer day. As Mateo fell asleep, the ceiling fan whirring softly above him, he had no idea that the ordinary life he took for granted was about to disappear. No idea that in 24 hours, his parents would be frantically calling his name in the streets. No idea that he was being watched, studied, selected. No idea that this golden summer was about to turn into 5 years of darkness. Sunday morning arrived with sunshine streaming through Mateo's bedroom window. He stretched and smiled, thinking about the new game waiting at Video Palace. His mom's voice floated up from the kitchen, the smell of pancakes pulling him out of bed. "Morning, sleepyhead," Diana said as he entered the kitchen. "Dad's already in the garage changing the oil in the car if you want to help him before you meet Daniel." "Yeah, I promised I would." Mateo grabbed the orange juice from the fridge. "We're having chile rellenos tonight, right?" "Of course. I bought the peppers yesterday." Diana ruffled his hair as she passed. "Be home before the streetlights come on." "Always am, Mom. Save me extra cheese on top." The morning passed quickly. Mateo helped his father with the car, handing him tools and learning about engines the way they always did on Sundays. By 11:30, he was showered and ready to meet Daniel at the video store. "I'm heading out," he called, grabbing his wallet from his dresser. "Got your house key?" Carlos asked, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. "Yep. See you at dinner." The walk to Video Palace took 20 minutes, the sun warm on Mateo's shoulders as he cut through the park. Daniel was already waiting outside when he arrived, bouncing on his heels with excitement. "Dude, they've only got one copy left. I've been standing here for 10 minutes making sure nobody grabs it." The boys pooled their money for the 3-day rental fee, arguing about which characters would be strongest as they walked to Daniel's house. For the next few hours, they sat cross-legged on Daniel's bedroom floor, controllers in hand, only breaking for sandwiches that Daniel's mom insisted they eat. "Man, I better get going," Mateo said, glancing at his watch. "Mom's making my favorite dinner, and I promised to be home before dark." "Want me to walk with you?" Daniel offered, already knowing the answer. Mateo always walked home alone, his house just 15 minutes away through familiar streets. "Nah, I'm good. Same time tomorrow to continue destroying you at this game?" "You wish," Daniel laughed, punching his friend's shoulder lightly. "See you tomorrow." Mateo turned the corner onto Maple Street just as the afternoon started shifting toward evening. He was maybe 30 houses away from home, walking with the confidence of someone who knew every crack in the sidewalk. A blue sedan slowed beside him, the driver rolling down the window. Mateo recognized Mr. Pfizer, the quiet man who had fixed their refrigerator last month. "Mateo," Pfizer called, his voice tight with what seemed like worry. "I'm glad I found you. Your mother's been in an accident. She's at Riverside General. Your father asked me to drive you there right away." The world seemed to tilt beneath Mateo's feet. His mother hurt? His first instinct was to run home, just to check. But what if it was true? What if his dad was already at the hospital with her? "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice small. "They're doing tests now. Your father called several neighbors trying to find you. Jump in. I'll take you straight there." Mateo hesitated for just a second, glancing toward his house down the street. Then fear for his mother overrode everything else, and he slid into the passenger seat. "Buckle up," Pfizer said, accelerating before Mateo could even close the door properly. As they drove, Mateo noticed they weren't heading toward the hospital. "This isn't the way to Riverside General," he said, the first flutter of unease stirring in his stomach. "They diverted us because of a traffic accident. This is a shortcut," Pfizer answered smoothly. His right hand moved from the steering wheel, reaching toward the glove compartment. "Here, your father said to give you this." When Mateo looked down, Pfizer's hand came up holding a cloth. Before Mateo could react, the cloth pressed against his face, a sickly sweet smell flooding his nostrils. He tried to push it away, but his arms felt suddenly heavy, his vision blurring at the edges. His last conscious thought was of his mother's chile rellenos getting cold on the dinner table. By 7:30 that evening, Diana was on the phone to Daniel's house, her voice still casual. "Hi, Mrs. Taylor. Is Mateo still there? He was supposed to be home for dinner." The casual tone vanished as she learned Mateo had left hours ago. By 8:15, Carlos was driving up and down neighborhood streets, stopping everyone he saw. "Have you seen my son?" 15? Black hair? Red t-shirt? By 9:30, the first police officers arrived at the Rodriguez home, taking initial statements and assuring the increasingly frantic parents that most missing teenagers return home on their own. But Diana knew. With the bone-deep certainty of a mother, she knew something was terribly wrong. Mateo had never missed dinner without calling. He had never broken curfew. As midnight approached with no sign of Mateo, the official search began. Neighbors formed groups to comb the area, flashlights sweeping across yards and vacant lots. Diana and Carlos huddled on their porch, jumping at the sound of every approaching car, hoping against hope that each set of headlights would reveal their son walking up the driveway with some ordinary explanation for his absence. None did. Mateo woke to complete darkness and the worst headache of his life. His mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. For several confused moments, he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then fragments began returning. Walking home, Pfizer's car, something about his mother being hurt, a sweet-smelling cloth pressed against his face. Panic surged through him as reality snapped into focus. He tried to sit up too quickly and immediately felt dizzy. Reaching out blindly, his hands found the edge of what seemed to be a bed. Slowly, he swung his legs over the side, feet touching cold concrete. "Hello?" His voice sounded strange in the darkness, swallowed up as if the space around him was absorbing sound. "Is anyone there?" No response. Mateo stood cautiously, arms extended to avoid bumping into anything. 3 careful steps forward, his hands hit a wall. Following it, he traced the perimeter of the room. Small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. A desk bolted to one wall. A chair. A small bookshelf. In one corner, what felt like a tiny bathroom area with a toilet and sink. No windows. No light switch that he could find. No door handle on the inside of what was clearly a heavy metal door. Panic threatened to overwhelm him again. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to think logically. This was a basement room, obviously designed to keep someone in. Pfizer had taken him, had lied about his mother being hurt, which meant his parents didn't know where he was, which meant they must be going crazy with worry. "Help!" he screamed, pounding on what he thought was the door. "Somebody help me! I'm down here!" He kept it up until his voice grew hoarse and his fists hurt. But there was no response, no indication that anyone could hear him. Hours passed, or maybe days. With no light, time became impossible to track. Mateo alternated between pounding on the door, screaming for help, and collapsing in exhausted sleep. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, thirst making his tongue stick to the roof of his mouth. When light suddenly flooded the room, it was so painful Mateo had to shield his eyes. The door opened, and Gregory Pfizer stood there with a tray holding a sandwich and a plastic cup of water. "You're making too much noise," Pfizer said, his voice flat and emotionless, so different from the concerned neighbor who had offered Mateo a ride. "There's no point. The room is soundproofed. No one can hear you." "My parents will find me," Mateo said, trying to keep his voice steady. "They'll know I'm missing. The police will be looking for me." "They'll look in the wrong places." Pfizer set the tray down on the desk. "Here are the rules. You will be fed regularly. You will be given books and basic supplies. You will have a bathroom. You will not attempt to escape. You will not make noise. If you follow the rules, things will be tolerable. If you don't—" He gestured toward the light switch outside the door. "Darkness can be very difficult to endure for extended periods." As soon as Pfizer finished speaking, Mateo lunged toward the open door, desperation overriding fear. But Pfizer was ready, stepping aside and pushing Mateo back with surprising strength. The door slammed shut, and darkness returned. Mateo slid to the floor, sobbing in the blackness that would become his most feared punishment over the coming years. During those first terrible days, Mateo refused to eat as a form of protest. It achieved nothing except weakening his body when strength might be crucial. Eventually, hunger forced his surrender, and he ate the bland sandwiches Pfizer provided. Slowly, a routine emerged. Meals appeared 3 times a day. The light would come on for set periods, go off at what Mateo assumed was night. Pfizer began bringing books, textbooks, classics, technical manuals, suggesting that he expected Mateo to continue some form of education. Mateo started keeping track of time by making small marks under the desk with his fingernail. 3 meals meant 1 day. 7 days made a week. 4 weeks, a month. It was the only way to maintain some connection to the world above. In his second week underground, Mateo discovered a small ventilation duct near the ceiling, covered with a mesh grate screwed firmly into concrete. Standing on the desk chair, he could press his ear against it, and sometimes hear muffled sounds, Pfizer moving around his house, garbage trucks on Thursday mornings, and most painful of all, the distant sounds of the neighborhood. One evening, he heard voices moving down the street, calling his name. A search party was passing directly above him. Mateo screamed until his throat was raw, knowing even as he did that the soundproofing made his efforts futile. That night, curled on his bed as the searchers moved on, he learned the true depth of despair. Sleep became both refuge and torment. In dreams, he was home, shooting baskets in the driveway, eating dinner with his parents, playing video games with Daniel. Waking brought fresh waves of grief and fear. To fight against forgetting, he began a nightly ritual, whispering to himself in the darkness. "My name is Mateo Luis Rodriguez. I live at 738 Maple Street. My parents are Diana and Carlos Rodriguez. I was born March 12, 1982. I disappeared on August 17, 1997. I am still me. I am still here. I will not disappear." It became his anchor, a way to hold on to who he was as days blurred together in the underground room. A way to remember that somewhere above him, on a street lined with maple trees, a family was searching for their missing boy. The dining room table in the Rodriguez home disappeared beneath maps marked with search grids, lists of Mateo's friends and acquaintances, and growing stacks of flyers bearing his school photograph. Diana could barely see the wood grain anymore, this table where they'd shared thousands of meals together, where Mateo had done his homework, where they'd played board games on rainy days. "We haven't checked the abandoned warehouses by the railroad," Diana said, circling an area on the map with a red marker. Her hands hadn't stopped shaking for days, but she refused to rest. Sleep came only when her body simply collapsed from exhaustion, usually for a few hours on the couch, never in her bed. Detective Sanderson nodded, making a note. "I'll send a team there tomorrow morning." He didn't tell her they'd already checked most of those buildings twice. Didn't tell her that with each passing day, statistics showed a decreasing likelihood of finding Mateo alive. Some things you don't say to a mother whose child is missing, even if they're true. Carlos came through the front door, clothes torn from pushing through overgrown lots, hands scratched and bleeding from moving debris. He'd been searching abandoned buildings on his own, unable to sit at home waiting for news. "Anything?" Diana asked, the same question she asked every time he returned. Carlos shook his head, the weight of failure visible in the slump of his shoulders. "I talked to that construction crew working on the new development. They're going to keep an eye out, check their sites." The phone rang. It rang constantly these days. Sometimes it was neighbors offering help, sometimes people reporting possible sightings that always led nowhere. Diana lunged for it, hope flaring and dying with each call. By the third week, things started to change. The volunteers who had filled their living room in the beginning dwindled to a core group of close friends and family. The local news, which had run daily updates on the search, began relegating Mateo's story to brief mentions. Detective Sanderson's visits became less frequent. "You're giving up on my son," Diana accused during one of Sanderson's visits, her voice breaking. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we're not giving up," he replied carefully. "But I need to be honest with you. Without new evidence, the active investigation will naturally wind down. We'll keep his case open, follow any leads that come in." "That's not good enough." Diana slammed her hand on the table, sending a stack of flyers cascading to the floor. "My son is out there somewhere. He needs us to find him." That night, after Sanderson left, the facade Carlos had maintained for weeks finally crumbled. Sitting on the edge of their bed, he broke down, great heaving sobs shaking his shoulders. Diana sat beside him, holding him with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "He's alive until we know otherwise," she whispered, rocking him gently. "We don't stop looking until we bring him home." As summer faded into fall, their search became embedded in daily routines. Every Saturday morning, they distributed updated flyers throughout Riverside and neighboring communities. Sundays were dedicated to physically searching new areas. Diana created and maintained a website documenting Mateo's case, posting regular updates even when there was nothing new to report. Their savings account emptied as they hired private investigators whose efforts yielded nothing. The strain manifested physically. Diana lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Carlos developed high blood pressure that required medication. Mateo's bedroom remained untouched, becoming a shrine to the moment time stopped for the Rodriguez family. Diana sometimes sat on his bed, holding his basketball jersey, trying to feel some connection to her son. Christmas came and went without celebration, marking 130 days since Mateo vanished. The first anniversary of his disappearance brought renewed media attention. A candlelight vigil filled Maple Street with hundreds of supporters, many holding posters with Mateo's face and the word "missing" in bold red letters. Detective Sanderson, now pursuing other cases but still nominally assigned to Mateo's file, attended in civilian clothes, standing at the periphery. Diana addressed the crowd with unwavering conviction. "My son is alive," she told the assembled neighbors and cameras, ignoring the pitying glances exchanged behind raised candles. "Someone knows where he is. Someone has seen something. Please, if you're watching this, and you have information about Mateo, contact us. There will be no questions, no consequences. We just want our son home." What the cameras didn't capture was the growing division between Diana and Carlos behind closed doors. While Diana's certainty about Mateo's survival had crystallized into something approaching faith, Carlos had begun the torturous process of accepting what statistics suggested was most likely: that their son was dead, his body hidden where their searches couldn't find it. "Diana," Carlos said one night, his voice careful, "it might be time to consider moving forward somehow." "Moving forward?" The word sounded hollow to her. "What does that even mean?" "I don't know. Maybe talking to someone. A grief counselor." "I'm not grieving," Diana snapped. "Grief is for people who've lost someone. Mateo isn't lost. He's missing. There's a difference." The fundamental divergence in their perspectives created a growing chasm between them. They still lived in the same house, still worked together on the search, but emotional connection frayed a little more each day. When the Henderson family put their house on Maple Street up for sale that spring, Carlos suggested it might be time for them to consider moving as well. The proposal triggered the first explosive argument of their marriage. "I will never leave this house while Mateo might be trying to find his way back to it," Diana said, her voice rising with every word. "Never." Carlos retreated from the suggestion, but the damage was done. That night, they slept in separate rooms for the first time in their marriage, the physical distance merely formalizing the emotional gulf between them. Neither was aware that Diana's recurring dreams, where she saw Matteo behind a door she couldn't open, always on their same street, contained an element of terrible truth. Neither knew that their son lay imprisoned just 3 houses away, beneath the feet of Gregory Pfizer, who occasionally stood at his front window watching Diana distribute flyers, with his carefully hidden secret, listening to her movements through the same ventilation system that allowed Matteo his only connection to the world above. 6 months into captivity, Matteo had stopped screaming. The boy who had pounded on the door until his fists bled was gone, replaced by someone more calculating, more patient. He understood now that escape would come through observation and strategy, not brute force. He had mapped Pfizer's patterns with the precision of a scientist. Weekdays, Pfizer left at 8:15 in the morning and returned at 5:40 in the evening, presumably for work. Tuesday evenings, he shopped for groceries, leaving the house empty for 47 minutes. He received no visitors and made few phone calls. These facts were currency in Matteo's new economy of information. The room had revealed its secrets through methodical examination. The ventilation duct was too small for escape and opened into a sealed system. The door hinges were on the outside. The walls were reinforced concrete. The plumbing connections offered no viable exit. Physical escape, at least immediately, seemed impossible. So Matteo created another form of resistance, maintaining his sense of self. He developed strict mental routines, allocating specific periods for mathematics problems he created in his head, for physical exercise within the confines of the small room, and for elaborately detailed fantasies of rescue that kept hope alive. Education became his unexpected lifeline. Pfizer, for reasons Matteo couldn't fully understand, provided textbooks covering high school curriculum, mathematics, physics, literature, history. Whether this represented some twisted attempt at normalcy or simply a mechanism to keep his captive occupied remained unclear, but Matteo seized this opportunity with strategic intent. He demonstrated enough progress to keep the books coming, recognizing them not just as mental stimulation, but as potential weapons against the crushing monotony that threatened his sanity. He created a regimented study schedule, working through problems and essays with disciplined focus. "I need more advanced physics books," Matteo said during one of Pfizer's brief visits, keeping his voice neutral, neither too eager nor too demanding. "I've finished these problems." Pfizer studied him for a moment before nodding. The next day, he brought college-level physics texts, small victory, carefully logged in Matteo's mental catalog. The mirror in the small bathroom became both torture device and crucial tool. Matteo watched himself change, his face thinning as baby fat disappeared, his height increasing several inches during year 2, his voice deepening in isolation, with no one to mark the transition. To counter the disconnect between his changing body and his sense of identity, Matteo began speaking to himself when alone, initially in whispers to avoid Pfizer's notice, later with more confidence during the predictable periods when the house above was empty. "Remember when Dad taught you to shoot free throws?" he would tell his reflection. "Remember how Mom made hot chocolate with cinnamon on rainy days? Remember the time Daniel got stuck in that tree in the park and the fire department had to come?" His reflection became his audience, the only witness to his continued existence as the person he was before August 17, 1997. As captivity extended beyond a year, Matteo developed increasingly sophisticated psychological tactics in his interactions with Pfizer. He carefully maintained a facade of subdued compliance, not so broken as to appear defeated, which might make him less interesting to his captor, but not so resistant as to provoke punishment. He learned to anticipate Pfizer's moods by the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, adjusting his own demeanor accordingly. He asked occasional questions about the outside world, gauging which topics caused Pfizer to withdraw and which might extend his brief visits. Most unsettling was his discovery that showing appropriate gratitude for small privileges encouraged more of them. When Pfizer brought him a slightly better meal than usual, Matteo would say thank you, his voice carefully modulated to sound sincere without being obsequious. This deliberate manipulation represented his most morally complex adaptation, the line between strategic performance and genuine Stockholm Syndrome occasionally blurring in ways that troubled his dreams. On the day Pfizer brought him a chess set, explaining that they would play weekly games, Matteo recognized a significant shift in their dynamic, one that presented both new dangers and potential opportunities. "I used to play with my father," Matteo said, the truth serving his strategic ends for once. "Then you should be a worthy opponent," Pfizer replied, setting up the board. The third year of captivity introduced Matteo's most ambitious survival strategy, a deliberate program of physical preparation. The limited space of his room became an improvised gymnasium as he developed a rigorous exercise routine: push-ups, sit-ups, isometric holds, and careful stretching to maintain muscle tone and flexibility. He did this not just to combat the physical deterioration of confinement, but as conscious preparation for eventual escape. Every movement had dual purpose: maintaining health while building specific strengths that might be needed in various escape scenarios he mentally rehearsed. Alongside this physical regimen, Matteo sharpened his observational skills, noting subtle details about Pfizer that might prove useful. The keys always kept on his right side, the slight limp that worsened in cold weather, the fact that he never entered the room without first announcing himself, suggesting possible anxiety about confrontation. While these observations might never lead to the perfect escape opportunity Matteo awaited, the very act of gathering and analyzing them preserved something essential to his humanity: agency, the capacity to plan, the refusal to become merely an object in Pfizer's disturbed collection. In the psychological war for survival, Matteo's greatest weapon became his patient, methodical mind, cataloging weaknesses and waiting for the single mistake that might finally bring freedom. "My name is Matteo Luis Rodriguez," he whispered to himself each night, the familiar litany now expanded. "I live at 738 Maple Street. My parents are Diana and Carlos Rodriguez. I am a prisoner, not a victim. I am waiting, not surrendering. I will go home." By the second anniversary of Matteo's disappearance, the Rodriguez home had become a house divided by grief expressed in fundamentally incompatible ways. Diana's bedroom wall had transformed into an investigation board that would have impressed professional detectives. Maps, timelines, photographs connected by colored strings, newspaper clippings, and notes from reported sightings arranged in meticulously maintained categories. Carlos could no longer enter this room without feeling suffocated. What Diana saw as necessary organization, he privately considered the physical manifestation of her inability to accept reality. His own grief had taken a different form, quieter, turned inward, expressed through long hours at work, and gradually disposing of his personal possessions, as if preparing for eventual departure. They still lived under the same roof, but their home had become a battleground of opposing coping mechanisms. Meals were eaten in silence or filled with superficial conversation that carefully navigated around the absence that defined their existence. "I found a new area to post flyers," Diana said over a dinner neither of them was really eating. "The shopping center on Riverside Drive has a community board. They said I could put up a new one every week." Carlos nodded, not mentioning that they'd been putting up flyers for 2 years with no results. "That's good. And I'm thinking we should expand the search to San Bernardino County. I know it's a bit far, But what if someone took him there? What if... Diana. Carlos set down his fork. That would cost money we don't have anymore. We have some savings left. For what? More flyers? More private investigators who find nothing? At some point we have to... Have to what? Her voice had an edge that had become all too familiar. Carlos finally said what he'd been thinking for months. We should consider setting up some kind of memorial for Mateo. Start the process of mourning properly. The words hung in the air between them, the first explicit acknowledgement of his belief that their son was dead. Diana's response was physically visceral, pushing away from the table, hands trembling. If you give up on our son, you give up on me too. It was an ultimatum that would define the next phase of their marriage. That night, Carlos moved his belongings into the guest room, a physical separation that merely formalized the emotional distance growing between them. They continued living under the same roof, partners in name, but divided by the most fundamental question of their existence: whether to preserve hope or accept loss. The community around them began taking sides in this unspoken division. Friends who had initially supported the search without question now privately expressed concern about Diana's unwillingness to move on, using phrases like unhealthy denial when Carlos sought their counsel. It's been 2 years, Carlos's friend Miguel said during a rare night out, both men nursing beers at a local bar. Nobody wants to say it to Diana's face, but at some point you have to accept reality for your own sanity. Others, particularly members of Diana's prayer group, reinforced her conviction with stories of miraculous returns and discoveries years after disappearances. My cousin's friend knew a family whose daughter was found 3 years after she vanished, Maria from the church told Diana. Don't let anyone tell you to give up hope. Detective Sanderson, now promoted to a different department but still maintaining contact with the family, delicately suggested grief counseling during a rare visit. It might help both of you process what you're going through, he said carefully, presenting it as support rather than surrender. I know some excellent therapists who specialize in these situations. The suggestion received dramatically different receptions. Carlos quietly collected the recommended resources, while Diana interpreted it as yet another institution abandoning her son. I don't need therapy, she told Sanderson, her voice tight. I need people to keep looking for my son. The neighborhood itself had largely returned to normal rhythms. New families had moved on to Maple Street with only vague awareness of the tragedy that had occurred years earlier. Children played in the same spots where search parties had once gathered. The annual candlelight vigil, once attended by hundreds, drew barely 20 participants on the 3rd anniversary. Diana's search evolved into increasingly ritualized patterns as the 3rd year stretched into the 4th. Every morning began with updates to her website, checking for messages or reported sightings. Thursdays were dedicated to distributing flyers in a methodically expanding radius from Riverside. The first Saturday of each month involved organizing the dwindling search volunteers to examine new areas. Most telling was her Sunday routine, walking the length of Maple Street itself, passing each house slowly as though expecting Mateo to suddenly emerge from one of them. This particular ritual became the subject of concerned whispers among neighbors who watched from behind curtains as Diana paused before certain houses, sometimes appearing to listen intently before moving on. What no one realized, least of all Diana herself, was that her instincts contained an element of terrible accuracy. Her lingering presence outside the Pfizer house corresponded to days when Mateo was being permitted above the basement level for supervised cleaning tasks, moments when mother and son were separated by mere walls rather than the presumed distances of abduction or death. Carlos found unexpected solace in an evolving relationship with Daniel, Mateo's best friend, who had remained connected to the family throughout the ordeal. Now 17, and preparing for college, Daniel visited regularly, initially out of loyalty to Mateo, but increasingly as genuine support for Carlos. They rarely spoke directly about Mateo, instead finding connection through shared projects in Carlos's garage workshop, restoring an old motorcycle, building furniture, practical tasks with tangible outcomes that provided temporary relief from emotional paralysis. "You're good with these tools," Carlos told Daniel one Saturday afternoon as they worked on the motorcycle. Mateo was always taking things apart, figuring out how they worked. It was one of the rare times he spoke of his son in the past tense, the words slipping out before he could catch them. Daniel pretended not to notice, focusing on tightening a bolt. "Yeah, he showed me how to fix my Nintendo when it stopped working. Always could figure out mechanical stuff better than me." Diana viewed these interactions with complex emotions, grateful for Daniel's continued presence, but disturbed by what she perceived as Carlos and Daniel mutually reinforcing the acceptance of Mateo's death. By the 4th anniversary, Carlos and Diana functioned less as a married couple than as reluctant collaborators in maintaining the physical structure of a household that no longer qualified as a home, each privately wondering how long this arrangement could continue without some resolution to the question that divided them. Is Mateo still alive? In the 4th year of captivity, the weekly chess games between Mateo and Pfizer evolved into something far beyond mere recreation. What began as another method of control on Pfizer's part had transformed through Mateo's careful cultivation into their most substantive interaction. Now 19, Mateo had developed a strategic approach to these games that extended beyond the board itself. He deliberately maintained a specific win-loss ratio, skillful enough to provide an interesting challenge, but losing just often enough to protect Pfizer's sense of superiority. "Knight to e5, Mateo said, moving the piece across the board. It was a decent move, but not his best option. A calculated choice that would keep the game competitive without being threatening. Pfizer studied the board, his face betraying nothing. These moments, when his captor's attention was divided, provided Mateo's best opportunities for gathering information. "Have you always lived in Riverside?" Mateo asked, the question casual, as if making conversation to fill the silence. "No," Pfizer replied, moving his bishop. "Lived in San Bernardino before. Check." Mateo pretended to be surprised by the check, though he'd seen it coming. "What made you move?" he asked, moving his king to safety. "Problems with the neighbors," Pfizer said, the brief phrase sending ice through Mateo's veins even as he maintained his carefully neutral expression. This casual reference immediately connected to Mateo's memories of unsolved disappearances in San Bernardino mentioned in news reports before his own abduction. The implication was clear. Mateo might not be Pfizer's first victim, though whether previous captives escaped, were released, or met darker fates remained unnervingly unclear. Through these fragmentary exchanges over months of games, Mateo had pieced together crucial information. Pfizer worked as a freelance appliance repair technician, lived alone, had no significant relationships, and maintained minimal community involvement. The chess games served another critical function. They allowed Mateo to implement his most ambitious psychological strategy to date, creating the illusion of emotional dependency. Over months of carefully measured responses, Mateo constructed a persona that appeared to be developing attachment to his captor, exhibiting subtle signs of Stockholm Syndrome without overplaying his hand. "That book you brought me last week was interesting," Mateo would say, showing appropriate appreciation for small privileges. "I liked the author's perspective on engineering principles." Or when Pfizer brought a slightly better meal than usual. "Thank you. This is really good." Small comments, carefully timed, creating the impression of someone gradually adapting to circumstances rather than actively resisting them. This performance required extraordinary psychological control, particularly when Mateo's authentic emotions trended toward intense hatred and disgust. The mental compartmentalization necessary for this deception became both Mateo's greatest achievement and his deepest fear, the worry that the line between performance and reality might blur beyond recognition. Yet he persisted in this unsettling charade, recognizing that Pfizer's guard lowered proportionally to his belief in Mateo's adaptation. Pfizer responded to Mateo's apparent adaptation with subtle shifts in his own behavior. The basement door was occasionally left unlocked during daytime hours when Pfizer was home, testing Mateo's compliance. Supervised trips to the main floor for cleaning tasks increased in frequency and duration. "You can clean the kitchen today," Pfizer announced one Tuesday morning. "I'll be working on the furnace, but I'll be in the house." These opportunities were invaluable reconnaissance missions. While dusting shelves or mopping floors, Mateo's eyes meticulously mapped the house layout, identified potential weapons, cataloged exits, and searched for any communication devices. These trips revealed a disturbing reality. The house windows were covered with blackout material and reinforced with security bars. The doors featured multiple advanced locks, and no functioning phones were visible. The fortress-like modifications confirmed what Mateo had long suspected. Pfizer's preparation for keeping a captive predated his abduction by considerable time. Most significantly, Pfizer began sharing limited information about the outside world, including carefully edited newspaper sections. Whether these changes represented genuine relaxation of security or calculated tests remained unclear, but Mateo approached each with surgical precision, demonstrating enough initiative to reinforce Pfizer's growing trust while carefully avoiding any action that might trigger suspicion. As the weekly chess games continued, Mateo implemented the next phase of his strategy: selective self-disclosure. He began sharing carefully chosen personal memories and thoughts, creating the impression of increasing trust while actually revealing nothing that could compromise his core self. "I used to play basketball a lot," Mateo said during one game, the disclosure safe, something Pfizer likely already knew from stalking him before the abduction. "I miss the feeling of running sometimes." This controlled vulnerability elicited reciprocal disclosures from Pfizer, who gradually revealed fragments of his own history: a childhood marked by isolation, institutional care following parental abandonment, a profound sense of invisibility in social contexts. "People never really saw me," Pfizer said once, in a rare moment of openness. "I was always overlooked." Mateo absorbed these revelations with outward empathy that masked his true purpose: building a psychological profile to exploit weaknesses. The culmination of their psychological chess match arrived unexpectedly during Year 5, when Pfizer announced he was considering teaching Mateo basic appliance repair skills. "You have an aptitude for mechanical things," Pfizer said. "You might as well learn something useful." This development represented both opportunity and danger. Greater access to tools and house areas balanced against the possibility that Pfizer envisioned a disturbing long-term arrangement with Mateo as some form of apprentice or companion. With meticulous care, Mateo expressed measured enthusiasm for this possibility. "I'd like that. I've always been interested in how things work." Internally, he accelerated his escape preparations. The repair training introduced new variables: specialized tools that could serve as weapons or escape implements, knowledge about household systems that might reveal vulnerabilities, and most importantly, heightened trust that might eventually lead to a critical mistake in security. As Mateo mastered basic electrical repair under Pfizer's supervision, the parallel psychological game approached its endgame. Both captor and captive believed they were directing the relationship toward their preferred outcome: Pfizer toward some perverse normalization of their arrangement. Mateo toward the single opportunity that would end 5 years of calculated performance. Their weekly chess games continued, pieces moving across the board in patterns that mirrored the larger strategic battle playing out between them, neither yet recognizing how close they were to the critical moment when an external factor would unexpectedly transform their closed system. "Knight takes pawn," Mateo said, making his move. "I think you're teaching me too well." Pfizer smiled slightly, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Perhaps. But remember, I always think several moves ahead." "So do I," Mateo thought, carefully maintaining his pleasant expression. "So do I." Spring 2002 found Diana Rodriguez at her lowest point since Mateo's disappearance. The 5th anniversary approached with a finality she refused to acknowledge, but increasingly feared. Her search had contracted to increasingly ritualistic patterns. The website updates continued, but generated no responses. The flyers she distributed yellowed in shop windows before being replaced. Her Sunday walks along Maple Street drew concerned glances from newer residents who knew her only as the woman who lost her son. Carlos had moved out 3 months earlier, the prolonged limbo of their marriage finally giving way to a separation. Diana maintained the house alone now, its emptiness a physical manifestation of the losses accumulating in her life. Her hair had gone prematurely gray, her once vibrant appearance now marked by the visible weight of unresolved grief. Yet amid this deterioration, something new had emerged. A recurring dream so vivid and consistent it had transcended ordinary nightmare to become what Diana's increasingly spiritual framework interpreted as vision or omen. Mateo behind a green door, not crying out but simply waiting, somewhere much closer than anyone had searched. "It's always the same door," Diana explained to her prayer group, the women listening with expressions ranging from deep sympathy to barely concealed skepticism. "Green, with peeling paint. There's a broken step at the entrance, and a wind chime with sailing ships hanging from the porch ceiling." "Dreams can be our subconscious trying to make sense of trauma," suggested Elaine, the newest member of the group, who had mentioned once that she was studying psychology. "Or they can be messages," countered Maria firmly. "God works in mysterious ways." Diana had described these details to increasingly distant Detective Sanderson, and finally to a reluctant Carlos, who gently suggested these images represented her mind's attempt to create resolution where none existed. On a rain-soaked Tuesday in April, Diana walked to the grocery store, her mind occupied with the mundane task of restocking her nearly empty refrigerator. Passing the Pfizer house, a property she had walked by hundreds of times during her methodical neighborhood searches, she stopped mid-step, grocery bags hanging forgotten from nerveless fingers as rain soaked through her light jacket. Recent wind damage had partially stripped the shutters of their black paint, revealing an underlying green. The concrete step, cracked since winter frost, and the newly installed wind chime, sailing ships tinkling in the spring breeze, completed a tableau identical to her recurring dream. Diana stood transfixed, the impossible correspondence between dream and reality triggering something beyond rational thought, a mother's intuition distilled to its purest essence. Without conscious decision, Diana approached the Pfizer house with a deliberate calm that belied the hurricane of emotion beneath. She had knocked on this door before, years earlier during the initial neighborhood search, when Gregory Pfizer presented as just another concerned resident, allowing volunteers to check his property. Now she stood before the same door, seeing it with entirely new awareness, noting details overlooked during previous encounters. The multiple locks, the unusual thickness of the door itself, the barely visible security camera disguised as a decorative element. When Pfizer answered, his initial expression, a flash of alarm quickly masked by his usual bland politeness, registered with Diana in a way it never had before. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, his voice even, "is everything all right?" "I'm collecting donations for the Children's Hospital fundraiser," Diana lied smoothly, surprising herself with how easily the falsehood came. "We're trying to raise money for the new pediatric wing." As they spoke, Diana remained hyper-aware of every aspect of the house visible behind Pfizer. The immaculate organization, the absence of personal photographs, the blackout curtains visible on a side window. Nothing tangible justified her growing certainty. Yet as she left with Pfizer's token donation, Diana knew with absolute conviction what her years of searching had failed to reveal. Her son was in this house. Diana's next actions revealed both remarkable restraint and strategic thinking previously obscured by grief. Rather than confronting Pfizer directly or contacting authorities with nothing but dreams and intuition as evidence, she established discreet surveillance from her living room window, documenting Pfizer's comings and goings with methodical precision. She reconnected with Detective Sanderson, now retired, approaching him not as the grieving mother he remembered, but as an investigator presenting carefully observed patterns. "He leaves every weekday at 8:15 exactly and returns at 5:40, Diana explained, showing Sanderson her notebook filled with dates and times. "Tuesday evenings between 6:30 and 7:15, he goes grocery shopping. His van says he's an appliance repair technician, but it never has any visible tools." Sanderson listened with professional skepticism tempered by genuine concern, particularly when Diana acknowledged the possibility she was constructing connections from coincidence. "I know how this sounds," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I know you probably think I'm just a desperate mother who can't let go. Maybe I am. But what if I'm right?" His promise to make informal inquiries into Pfizer's background represented a careful compromise, offering support without fully validating what still appeared to be desperate hope-finding random targets. Diana accepted this limited response while privately continuing her own investigation. The catalyst arrived through apparent coincidence, but what Diana later described as divine intervention. A water main break affecting several houses on Maple Street, including Pfizer's. With emergency repairs requiring immediate access to affected properties, the city dispatched service teams including Miguel Torres, a plumber whose assigned territory included the north side of the street. When Pfizer reluctantly granted Torres access to examine potential basement flooding, the seemingly routine inspection initiated a cascade of events that would finally breach the carefully constructed walls of Mateo's prison. Torres, diligent in his assessment, noticed inconsistencies in the basement layout, dimensions that didn't match the house footprint, a section of newer concrete contrasting with the original foundation, ventilation modifications with no apparent purpose. These observations might have remained professional curiosities, except for Torres's background. His brother disappeared in San Bernardino 7 years earlier, a loss that sensitized him to the markers of concealment and deception. As Torres completed his inspection, deliberately mentioning the need for a comprehensive basement assessment team to return the following day, the stage was set for Mateo's imprisonment to end not through his elaborate chess strategy, but through the unplanned intersection of infrastructure failure, professional diligence, and a fellow survivor's heightened awareness of how predators hide their crimes. "Everything looks okay for now, Mr. Pfizer," Torres said, making notes on his clipboard while mentally cataloging everything that wasn't okay at all. "But we'll need a specialized team to check the foundation tomorrow. Water damage can be tricky in these older homes." Pfizer frowned slightly. "Is that really necessary? I don't see any water." "Better safe than sorry," Torres replied, his casual tone masking the urgency he felt to get out of the house and make some very important phone calls. "We've had foundations collapse from hidden damage before. The team will be quick, I promise. As Torres left, he noted Diana Rodriguez watching from her front window across the street, her eyes tracking his movements with an intensity that suggested she might be harboring the same suspicions that had just crystallized in his mind. Miguel Torres parked his city maintenance van around the corner from Maple Street, heart racing as he pulled out his cell phone. His hands shook slightly as he dialed his supervisor's number, explaining that he needed an emergency team for a complex water damage situation at the Pfizer house. Make it look official, Torres added. Multiple vehicles, full team, but this isn't about water damage. His supervisor, who had known Torres for years, heard the urgency in his voice and agreed without further questions. Torres's second call went to Detective Sarah Chen, who had inherited several cold cases, including Mateo's disappearance after Sanderson's retirement. Torres knew Chen through community outreach programs focused on missing persons, his volunteer work born from his brother's unsolved disappearance. I can't explain everything over the phone, Torres said, keeping his voice low despite being alone in the van. But I just inspected Gregory Pfizer's basement on Maple Street, and something's very wrong. The dimensions don't match up. There's a section of newer concrete that makes no sense, and ventilation that goes nowhere. Chen, unlike many of her colleagues, had never fully relegated Mateo's case to the statistical inevitability of permanent disappearance. I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said without hesitation. Don't approach the house again. Wait for me. The emergency response team arrived first, 4 city workers in official vehicles providing perfect cover for Chen's unmarked car. Pfizer answered the door with visible agitation, his customary controlled demeanor showing cracks. I don't understand why this is necessary, he said, blocking the doorway slightly. Mr. Torres already checked everything this morning. Chen stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and official-looking ID displayed. I'm from the Structural Assessment Division. With water main breaks, we need to verify foundation integrity. It's standard procedure. The strategic approach worked, gaining entry without revealing police involvement or triggering potential defensive reactions. As the legitimate service workers began examining water damage in the main areas, Chen and Torres focused on the basement, their casual conversation masking deliberate scrutiny of the anomalies Torres had identified earlier. Chen's experienced eye quickly confirmed Torres's suspicions. The basement dimensions didn't match the house footprint, suggesting a concealed room. When she deliberately dropped her pen near the section of newer concrete, the knocking pattern she employed while retrieving it was not random, but a coded series used in search and rescue operations. The response was immediate and unmistakable. 3 clear knocks from behind the wall. Chen maintained remarkable composure, casually suggesting the team needed specialized equipment from their vehicles. Once outside, rapid mobilization replaced the pretense. Chen called for immediate backup, while Torres diverted the genuine service workers with explanations that transformed their confusion to cooperation. When Pfizer stepped onto the porch, sensing the shift in atmosphere, he found himself facing Chen's now displayed badge and the unmistakable authority in her stance. Mr. Pfizer, we have reason to believe there's someone in your basement who shouldn't be there. We're going to need access to the entire property immediately. Pfizer's reaction, a moment of calculation followed by attempted retreat into the house, confirmed every suspicion. The responding officers intercepted him before he reached the door, the arrest executed with efficiency that belied the thundering significance of the moment. As Pfizer was secured in a patrol car, Chen led the entry team back into the house, their focus now entirely on the concealed basement section. The wall had no visible door or access point, requiring careful examination before they discovered the mechanism. A bookshelf that pivoted to reveal a heavy metal door secured with multiple locks. The sounds from within had ceased, replaced by a silence that raised the stakes of every passing second. An officer with specialized training worked on the locks, while Chen spoke through the door. Mateo, Mateo Rodriguez? We're police officers. We're here to help you. You're safe now. No response came from the other side. When the final lock finally yielded, Chen pushed the door open slowly, revealing a scene that would haunt even veteran officers for years to come. A small room meticulously organized with books, basic furnishings, and the accumulated evidence of long-term captivity. And sitting perfectly still on the edge of the bed, a young man with hollow cheeks and watchful eyes who seemed simultaneously like a teenager and an old soul. Mateo Rodriguez? Chen asked softly, maintaining distance to avoid overwhelming him. His response came in a voice rusty from disuse with others. My name is Mateo Luis Rodriguez. I live at 738 Maple Street. My parents are Diana and Carlos Rodriguez. I was born March 12, 1982. I disappeared on August 17, 1997. The litany, delivered with mechanical precision, represented 5 years of nightly recitation, his refusal to let captivity erase his identity. Chen signaled for the medical response team, who entered with careful protocols established for trauma victims, their training evident in the measured pace of their approach. Mateo watched with unnerving calm as they checked his vital signs and condition, his cooperation complete, but his emotional responses muted, as though operating from behind a protective barrier. When asked if he needed anything, his first and only request encapsulated the surreal disconnect between captivity and freedom. Could you tell my mother I'm sorry I missed dinner? She was making chile rellenos. The decision to delay informing Diana until Mateo reached the hospital represented standard protocol for recovered missing persons, ensuring medical stability before emotional reunions. But for the officers aware of Diana's 5-year vigil, it felt like cruel prolongation of her wait. Chen insisted on being the one to tell her. She deserves to hear it from someone who understands what this means, she told her supervisor. When Chen finally arrived at the Rodriguez home, Diana opened the door with the weary resignation of someone who had received too many false hopes. Her eyes registered the official police presence, but the familiar dullness remained, until Chen spoke. We found him, Mrs. Rodriguez. Mateo is alive. Diana became utterly still, as though the magnitude of the moment required complete recalibration of reality. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Where? He was being held in a house on this street. He's at Riverside General Hospital now. He's asking for you. The drive to the hospital passed in suspended animation, Chen providing minimal details about Mateo's physical condition. Stable, malnourished but not critical, while deliberately avoiding descriptions of the circumstances of his captivity. He's been through a traumatic experience, Chen explained gently. The doctors say he's remarkably stable, considering, but meeting you will be emotional for both of you. Diana barely registered the words, her focus entirely on what awaited beyond the hospital doors. As they approached Mateo's room, medical staff briefed her on approaching trauma survivors, advice she absorbed with single-minded determination. He may not react the way you expect, the doctor explained. He may seem withdrawn or overly calm. This is normal after prolonged trauma. Let him set the pace of the interaction. Diana nodded, though it wasn't clear how much she was absorbing. When the door to Mateo's room finally opened, she paused at the threshold, her eyes meeting those of the young man sitting upright in the hospital bed. No longer the 15-year-old boy from her memory, but a 20-year-old stranger with familiar eyes. Mom, he said, the single syllable containing universes of meaning. And then Diana crossed the distance between them, gathering her son into an embrace that bridged the impossible gap between loss and recovery, beginning the complex process of healing that would define their journey forward from this extraordinary moment of return. I never stopped looking for you, she whispered against his hair. Never. I know, Matteo replied softly. I heard you sometimes, through the vent, when you walked by on Sundays. Diana pulled back slightly, keeping her hands on his shoulders as if afraid he might disappear again. You were there all this time? On our street? Matteo nodded, his expression carefully controlled. 3 houses away, in Pfizer's basement. The revelation that her son had been so close, that she had walked past him countless times during her searches, hit Diana with physical force. She swayed slightly, and Matteo, with reflexes honed by years of calculating his every move, steadied her with a strength that surprised them both. It's not your fault, he said with conviction that seemed beyond his years. You couldn't have known. He planned everything very carefully. In that moment, their roles seemed briefly reversed, the son comforting the mother, the captive reassuring the searcher. It was the first indication of the complex readjustments their relationship would require in the days and weeks to come. Matteo's first 72 hours of freedom unfolded within the controlled environment of Riverside General Hospital's secure wing. The medical assessment revealed the physical toll of his imprisonment: significant vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight, mild malnutrition despite adequate caloric intake, and muscular development shaped by confined exercise rather than natural movement. But it was the psychological evaluation that commanded primary attention, conducted by Dr. Eleanor Winters, a specialist in trauma recovery. Her initial sessions with Matteo yielded observations that simultaneously concerned and impressed the medical team. His extraordinary psychological compartmentalization, his strategic thinking even in freedom, and his hypervigilance manifesting not as obvious anxiety, but as continuous environmental mapping, noting exits, cataloging potential threats, tracking movement patterns of hospital staff. The water pitcher is always refilled at 6:15 in the morning, Matteo told Dr. Winters during their second session. The night nurse checks vitals at 10:30 and again at 2. The security guard outside my door changes shift at midnight. Dr. Winters made a note. You're very observant. Patterns are important, Matteo replied simply. Understanding routines helped me survive. When offered choices after years of having none, what to eat, when to sleep, whom to see, Matteo experienced not liberation but visible distress, the paradox of freedom presenting immediate challenges to his carefully constructed survival mechanisms. Just tell me what I should have, he said when presented with a menu of breakfast options, his discomfort palpable. Whatever is normal. The most telling moment came when a nurse accidentally dropped a tray outside his room. Matteo's instantaneous transition to defensive positioning occurred without conscious thought, a visceral reminder that physical freedom preceded psychological liberation by an undetermined distance. Diana established herself as a constant presence, sleeping in the hospital room's recliner despite staff suggestions that she rest at home. Her protective instincts, frustrated for 5 years, now manifested as unwillingness to let Matteo out of her sight, a dedication matching his need for anchoring familiarity amid overwhelming change. Their interactions developed a careful rhythm, both intuitively avoiding direct discussion of the captivity while rebuilding connection through safer topics. Books Matteo read in confinement, Diana's website dedicated to finding him, neutral memories from before. Do you remember the time we went camping by the lake? Diana asked, arranging flowers someone had sent. When that raccoon stole all our marshmallows? Matteo smiled, the expression still looking slightly unfamiliar on his face. And Dad tried to chase it with a flashlight, but tripped over the cooler. These shared memories provided solid ground in the shifting landscape of their new reality. But the process revealed unexpected challenges. 5 years of separate experiences had created reference points unknown to the other, language patterns that evolved in isolation, assumptions that no longer applied. When Carlos arrived for his first visit, the dynamic shifted palpably. His shock at seeing his son as a young man, rather than the boy in his memory, created a momentary barrier that neither knew how to bridge. They regarded each other awkwardly, Carlos standing just inside the doorway as if unsure of his welcome. "You got tall," Carlos finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Mateo nodded. 6 feet, the doctor said. "That's, taller than me now." The reunion unfolded with careful navigation around emotional landmines, improved only when Carlos thought to bring photographs documenting the years Mateo missed: Daniel's graduation, neighborhood changes, Diana's continuing search efforts. "Daniel's going to college now?" Mateo asked, studying a photo of his friend in graduation cap and gown. "UC Riverside, computer science," Carlos explained. "He still asks about you. All the time." These tangible connections to the parallel life that continued without him provided Mateo crucial context for understanding the world he'd returned to, each image representing a piece of the complex puzzle he needed to assemble to reconcile his interrupted existence. On the 4th day, Dr. Winters facilitated Mateo's first structured debriefing with Detective Chen, a carefully managed session balancing investigative needs against psychological fragility. Mateo approached this interaction with the same strategic calculation that defined his captivity, demonstrating remarkable recall of specific details useful to prosecution, while maintaining emotional distance through precise, almost clinical language. The room was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, he explained. The door had 3 locks, a deadbolt, a chain, and some type of electronic mechanism that I believe he controlled remotely. The ventilation system connected to the main house ductwork, but was filtered and reduced in size to prevent communication. When Chen gently asked about the initial abduction, Mateo's response revealed the complex guilt he carried. "I got into his car because he said my mother was hurt. I knew not to get into cars with strangers. It was a miscalculation." This framing, recasting trauma as strategic error rather than victimization, provided insight into how Mateo had maintained his sense of agency throughout captivity. The session concluded with Chen sharing limited information about Pfizer's background, previous residences in areas with unsolved disappearances, specialized construction training explaining the sophisticated confinement space, no known family connections or relationships. The confirmation that Mateo likely represented Pfizer's only surviving victim created a burden of representation he absorbed with characteristic compartmentalization, adding this knowledge to the complex psychological architecture he'd constructed to process his experience. The transition from hospital to home arrived sooner than medical staff recommended, but aligned with Mateo's increasingly vocal desire for familiar surroundings. The return to 738 Maple Street became a media event, despite efforts to maintain privacy, news vans lining the neighborhood as the family navigated the final stretch of driveway. Mateo observed this attention with analytical detachment, noting to Diana, "They're interested because I'm a statistical anomaly. Most kids who disappear don't come back." Inside, the preserved shrine of his childhood bedroom presented immediate challenge. The space frozen in time, representing the life interrupted rather than the one resumed. After a brief scan of the unchanged posters, gaming system, and school books, Mateo made a request that surprised Diana with its insight. "I need to change this room. It needs to become mine again, not a memorial." This awareness of the symbolic weight of physical spaces demonstrated a psychological sophistication that both encouraged and concerned his treatment team. That night, sleep proved elusive as Mateo experienced the paradoxical anxiety of unlimited space after years of confinement. The solution emerged through practicality rather than therapy. He constructed a sleeping area in the closet, the enclosed space providing the security necessary for rest while he adapted to freedom's expansiveness. Diana discovered this arrangement during her midnight check, her initial distress giving way to understanding that recovery would follow paths she could not anticipate or control. "Is it easier in there?" she asked softly from the bedroom doorway. Mateo nodded from his closet nest of blankets. "Less exposed? Just for now." "Whatever you need," Diana said. "Whatever helps." The first week of freedom culminated in a carefully orchestrated reunion with Daniel, now 20, and in his sophomore year at UC Riverside. The meeting, arranged with guidance from Dr. Winters, took place in the Rodriguez backyard, neutral territory providing both openness and privacy from media attention. Daniel's approach combined remarkable sensitivity with refusal to treat Mateo as fragile, bringing his old Nintendo controller and a stack of the games they once played together. "I figured 5 years in a basement means you missed a lot of gaming evolution," he said with calculated normalcy that broke the tension more effectively than any careful therapeutic phrasing. "Wait till you see what they can do now. The graphics are insane." They settled into gameplay with muscle memory that bridged the 5-year gap, the familiar activity providing structure for conversation that gradually moved from surface reconnection to deeper sharing. "So, does this mean I finally get to beat you at Mario Kart?" Daniel asked, handing Mateo the controller. "Because you always crushed me before." Mateo smiled, the expression becoming more natural each time. "Don't count on it. I had a lot of time to plan my strategies." 2 weeks after Mateo's return, the preliminary hearing for Gregory Fizer introduced new complexities to the family's adjustment. Prosecutors outlined charges including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and child endangerment, with the possibility of additional charges pending investigation of connections to other disappearances. The proceedings forced confrontation with details of captivity that Mateo had carefully filtered in previous discussions. The soundproofed room's specifications suggesting premeditation, the elaborate monitoring systems, the psychological manipulation techniques employed over 5 years. Diana attended against the recommendations of both Dr. Winters and Detective Chen, her determination to understand everything her son experienced, overriding concerns about secondary trauma. She sat in the courtroom, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white, as prosecutors described the prison Fizer had constructed specifically to hold a child captive. Mateo chose not to attend, but requested complete transcripts, explaining to Dr. Winters, "I need to see how they translate my experience into legal language. I need to understand how the system processes what happened to me." This analytical approach to his own trauma continued to define his recovery process, simultaneously demonstrating resilience and raising concerns about delayed emotional processing. The hearing produced another significant development. Journalists uncovered Fizer's connection to 3 previous disappearances in San Bernardino County. Cases long considered cold, but now reopened with renewed urgency. This confirmation that Mateo represented the only known survivor of Fizer's pattern created both media pressure for his perspective and internal pressure to somehow represent those who never returned. "Do you feel any obligation to speak for the other victims?" Dr. Winters asked during a session after this news broke. Mateo considered the question with his characteristic deliberation. "I can only speak for myself. But I understand why people want me to represent something larger. I'm the statistical outlier, the one who came back." As the legal proceedings advanced, Carlos initiated a difficult conversation about his separation from Diana, arranging a private dinner with Mateo at a quiet restaurant away from media attention. The setting itself represented significant progress. Mateo's first extended public outing since his return, carefully planned with exposure therapy principles in mind. Over a meal Mateo barely touched, still adjusting to varied textures and flavors after years of bland captivity diets, Carlos explained the gradual dissolution of his marriage, how grief transformed into fundamentally incompatible coping mechanisms, how Diana's unshakable certainty that Mateo was alive and nearby conflicted with his own need for closure, how guilt over these differences created distance neither could bridge. "I thought I was protecting myself," Carlos said, his voice low. "And maybe Diana too. I thought accepting that you were gone was the only way forward. I was wrong." Mateo listened with the same careful attention he had developed during chess games with Pfizer, absorbing information without revealing immediate emotional response. "Mom never stopped believing you were alive," Carlos continued. "Not for a single day. I don't know how she knew, but she did." When Carlos finally asked for forgiveness, Mateo's reply demonstrated his evolving perspective. "You survived too, just differently. There's nothing to forgive about survival." This conversation represented a turning point in their reconnection, establishing new terms for their relationship based on mutual recognition of how trauma reshapes identity, rather than attempting to recreate the father-son dynamic that existed before the abduction. As they left the restaurant, Carlos hesitantly shared his hope for reconciliation with Diana, a possibility Mateo neither encouraged nor dismissed, understanding that his return had catalyzed reconsideration of decisions made during his absence without guaranteeing their reversal. The intersection of psychological recovery and legal proceedings created increasing tension as prosecutors requested Mateo's testimony for the upcoming trial. Dr. Winters advocated for alternatives such as recorded statements or written testimony, concerned about potential re-traumatization through direct confrontation with Pfizer in court. Mateo's response surprised both his treatment team and family. "I need to see him again, not for the prosecution's case, but for mine." This assertion of agency regarding his own recovery process led to a carefully structured courtroom visit during a pre-trial motion, allowing Mateo to observe Pfizer from the public gallery without requiring testimony. The encounter proved revelatory, not because Pfizer appeared monstrous, but because he appeared ordinary, diminished by the institutional setting and separation from his constructed power dynamic. "He looks smaller," Mateo told Dr. Winters afterward, his voice thoughtful. "I kept him giant in my mind because that made my survival more meaningful. But he's just a broken person who broke others." This recalibration of perspective began shifting Mateo's narrative framework from one of opposing an overwhelming force to recognizing the human scale of both his captor and his own resilience, a crucial step toward integration of his experience into a coherent life story rather than an identity-defining trauma. As media attention intensified with the approaching trial date, the family faced difficult decisions about public engagement. Initial statements through Detective Chen provided basic facts while requesting privacy, but mounting interview requests, book proposals, and documentary pitches demanded more substantive response. The debate revealed significant differences in family perspectives. Diana saw potential value in raising awareness about missing children and long-term recovery. Carlos worried about exploitation and re-traumatization, while Mateo approached the question with characteristic strategic analysis. During a family discussion that represented their first attempt at collective decision-making since his return, Mateo articulated a position that bridged these perspectives. "People want to understand what happened because it's statistically unusual. Most kids who disappear don't come back. If sharing certain parts of my experience helps find others or helps people understand survivors better, that has value, but it has to be controlled, not reactive." This nuanced approach led to the family's first joint decision, engaging a specialist in trauma-informed media management to develop guidelines for limited, purposeful public engagement that balanced educational value against privacy concerns. The process itself, beyond its practical outcomes, represented significant progress in family reintegration, establishing new patterns of communication that acknowledged their transformed individual and collective identities. The most profound truth emerged not through legal proceedings or public disclosure, but in the private therapeutic space Dr. Winters had established as Mateo's consistent sanctuary. During their 8th week of sessions, discussing his occasional preference for confined spaces when feeling overwhelmed, Mateo experienced his first significant emotional breakthrough. "The hardest part wasn't being taken," he began with uncharacteristic hesitation, his usually measured voice wavering slightly. "It was watching my life continue without me through that vent. Seeing Mom deliver food to neighbors during the first Christmas, watching Dad search the yard over and over, hearing their voices calling my name while I couldn't answer. That was worse than anything Pfizer did directly." This acknowledgement of witnessing his parents' grief without being able to alleviate it represented Mateo's first direct engagement with the emotional rather than strategic dimensions of his experience. The protective compartmentalization that had served him during captivity began showing deliberate, controlled cracks, not collapsing, but gradually allowing integration of emotional processing alongside the analytical framework that protected his core identity. Dr. Winters recognized this as the beginning of true recovery, not the absence of trauma's effects, but the ability to hold contradictory realities simultaneously: the strategic survivor and the grieving son, the calculated chess player and the teenager who lost irreplaceable years, the remarkable statistical anomaly and the ordinary young man attempting to build a future from an interrupted past. "I sometimes wonder who I would have been," Mateo said quietly near the end of the session, "if I'd just walked a different way home that day." "That's a question without an answer," Dr. Winters replied gently. "But who you are now, that's something you get to discover and in many ways decide." Mateo nodded, considering this. "I think I'm ready to start figuring that out." On the first anniversary of Mateo's rescue, the Rodriguez family marked the occasion not with public commemoration, but with quiet acknowledgement of distance traveled. The most visible changes manifested in their transformed home environment. Mateo's childhood bedroom had been completely redesigned, with his active participation, now reflecting his current interests and needs, rather than preserved memory. The investigation board that had dominated Diana's room was gone, its contents preserved in organized files, but no longer defining her living space. Carlos had gradually re-established presence in the household, not returning fully, but spending several evenings each week in family activities that represented careful rebuilding rather than attempted restoration of previous patterns. These physical adjustments mirrored the psychological reorganization each family member continued to navigate, not erasing the 5-year rupture, but incorporating it into new understanding of themselves individually and collectively. The anniversary passed without media coverage, the public narrative having gradually shifted to the legal proceedings against Pfizer, who had accepted a plea agreement avoiding trial in exchange for cooperation with investigations into other disappearances. This resolution, while denying the courtroom confrontation some had anticipated, provided what Mateo described as functional closure. Not emotional completion, but practical conclusion, allowing focus on recovery rather than judicial outcomes. "You know what's weird?" Mateo said as they shared a quiet dinner that evening. "A year ago today, I was still underground. Now we're just having spaghetti." Diana reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "That's what healing looks like sometimes. Just ordinary moments." Carlos nodded, passing the garlic bread. Ordinary is underrated. Mateo's reintegration into formal education represented perhaps the most significant marker of his adjusted trajectory. After intensive assessment and consideration of various options, he had opted against returning to traditional high school, instead pursuing a specialized program combining academic catch-up with college-level courses aligned with his self-directed learning during captivity. His mathematical abilities, maintained and developed through mental exercises during confinement, placed him at advanced undergraduate level despite formal educational interruption. This academic focus provided structure while accommodating his continuing adjustment to social environments, smaller classes, flexible scheduling, and understanding of his occasional need for withdrawal when stimulation became overwhelming. Dr. Winters continued weekly sessions, their focus evolving from acute trauma management to longer-term integration and identity development. Most encouraging to his treatment team was Mateo's emerging ability to plan for future possibilities rather than maintaining the perpetual present focus that had characterized his survival strategy. "I'm thinking about engineering programs," Mateo told Dr. Winters during a recent session, "specifically architectural engineering with a focus on security design." "That makes sense, given your experiences," Dr. Winters observed. Mateo nodded. "Engineering problems kept me sane during those years. Solving them for actual application rather than mental exercise seems like giving meaning to that time." Diana's transformation paralleled her son's in significant ways. Her identity, previously consumed by the search for Mateo, now undergoing careful reconstruction, incorporating both the determined advocate she had become and aspects of her pre-abduction self she'd nearly forgotten. The website originally dedicated to finding Mateo had evolved into a resource for families of missing children, particularly those cases extending beyond statistical recovery windows. Her experiences provided unique perspective on sustaining hope without denying reality, navigating law enforcement and media relationships, and maintaining family functioning during unresolved absence. What began as informal sharing through support groups had developed into structured presentations for both family organizations and professional agencies, her lived expertise complementing formal training programs. This purposeful channeling of experience provided meaning while allowing gradual separation from constant focus on trauma. "Someone asked me today if I feel vindicated," Diana told Carlos one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the street where their son had disappeared and miraculously returned. "About never giving up hope, about being right that he was alive." "What did you tell them?" Carlos asked. "That being right isn't the point. The point is learning to live with uncertainty without surrendering to it, whether the outcome is return or not." She paused, watching a neighborhood child ride by on a bicycle. "Not everyone gets the ending we got." Carlos's re-engagement with family life proceeded with careful negotiation of boundaries and expectations. Weekend projects in his workshop now included Mateo's participation, their shared activity focusing on process rather than conversation, creating space for comfortable silence that gradually accommodated more direct communication. His relationship with Diana evolved not toward conventional reconciliation, but toward respectful collaboration in supporting Mateo's recovery, while acknowledging the permanent changes in their own connection. The guilt he had carried regarding his acceptance of presumed death had transformed through therapy into recognition that different grief responses reflect individual needs rather than measuring devotion. When Daniel visited during college breaks, these gatherings often included Carlos, creating a broadened family configuration that accommodated both established bonds and newly forming connections. The workshop became a sanctuary for this expanded circle, the practical focus on creating or repairing tangible objects, providing metaphorical framework for the less visible reconstructions occurring in their relationships. "I'm thinking about building a proper workbench," Carlos mentioned during one such gathering. "Something big enough for multiple projects." "I could help with that," Mateo offered, examining his father's sketched plans. If we adjust these dimensions, we could make space for 3 people to work comfortably. The most profound measure of distance traveled emerged not through dramatic milestones, but through ordinary moments that would seem unremarkable without context. Matteo walking alone to the local market, a 5-minute journey representing enormous psychological territory crossed. Diana spending an afternoon reading for pleasure without checking her phone for case updates. Carlos laughing genuinely at dinner rather than producing the careful simulation of normalcy that had characterized early family meals after Matteo's return. Dr. Winters noted these developments with professional satisfaction, recognizing them as indicators of what trauma recovery literature identifies as post-traumatic growth, not erasure of experience, but integration leading to expanded rather than diminished perspective. The family still navigated challenges, Matteo's occasional flashbacks triggered by unpredictable stimuli, Diana's hypervigilance during his absences, Carlos's uncertainty about appropriate boundaries. But these no longer represented the entirety of their existence, instead taking place within the context of gradually expanding lives. "I have something to show you," Matteo said one evening, bringing a thick folder to the kitchen table where his parents were having coffee. "My application for the architectural engineering program at Cal Poly." Diana and Carlos exchanged a look, surprise mingled with pride. This was the first major life decision Matteo had made entirely on his own since his return. "It's a good program," Matteo continued, spreading out the materials. "And it's close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to, you know." "To be on your own," Diana finished for him, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "Not completely on my own," Matteo corrected with a small smile. "Just taking the next step." As his parents looked through the application materials, asking questions and offering support, Matteo felt a sense of alignment he hadn't experienced since before his abduction. The person he was, the person he might have been, and the person he was becoming gradually converging into something new but coherent. Later that night, standing in his redesigned bedroom, no longer a shrine to his 15-year-old self, nor a recreation of his underground prison, Matteo looked out the window at Maple Street. The same street where he had walked home from Daniel's house on that summer day in 1997. The same street where his mother had searched for 5 years, never giving up. The same street where he had been imprisoned and ultimately found. There had been a time when he thought he would never be able to look at this street without seeing it through the filter of trauma. Now, watching a neighborhood cat prowl along the sidewalk under streetlights, he found himself thinking not about the past, but about the future. About architectural sketches, about college applications, about the life waiting to be built. On Maple Street, the Rodriguez home had transformed from shrine to active household, its inhabitants neither pretending the 5-year rupture never occurred, nor allowing it to permanently determine their future course. They had become, in Matteo's carefully chosen words during his final media statement, not the family we were, nor the family we might have been, but the family we are now, shaped by separation, but not limited to its dimensions. For the boy from Maple Street who vanished, and the young man who returned, that hard-won perspective represented the most meaningful freedom of all.